Дорослі впевнені, що все залежить від них.
Unsere Eltern sind überzeugt, dass sie mehr als ihre Kinder wissen.
Они вроде бы делают все, чтобы нам, детям, было лучше.
Проте дорослі забувають запитати нас, а що для нас краще?
Adults sometimes forget that we are smart enough to understand a lot.
Дорослі знищують ліси, забруднюють водойми і повітря.
Багатим і бідним, дітям і дорослим, хлопчикам і дівчаткам всім однаково потрібне довкілля та й сприятливе середовище.
Наш спосіб життя може привести до того, що нам будуть показувати ліси, чисті річки і повітря без смогу тільки по телевізору.
Люди знищують ресурси, вирубують дерева, забруднюють річки, забуваючи при цьому про енергозбереження. Це коли можна менше спалювати енергії і отримувати більше користі.
Використовувати, наприклад, альтернативні джерела енергії.
Сонце, вітер, вода. Вони можуть нам давати достатньо енергії, не псуючи довкілля, не руйнуючи майбуття. Насправді, альтернатива є.
Look for alternatives.
Suche nach den Alternativen.
Діти обрали альтернативу!
Добрий вечір, шановні колеги. Ми не дарма почали з цього ролика, такого світлого і дитячого. Він сьогодні задасть фактично весь тон сьогоднішньої нашої розмови, основної розмови, яка буде присвячена альтернативній енергетиці, буде присвячена дітям, яких ви щойно бачили на екрані. Чому діти? Тому що ви прекрасно знаєте, що цим дітям вже доведеться жити в суспільстві, яке буде змушено обходитися без традиційних джерел енергії і будувати своє життя, і жити з тим, що послала їм природа. Біомаса, вітер, сонце, вода. І сьогодні я хочу представити гостей нашої зустрічі. Це пан Райнер, він президент Європейського Союзу альтернативної енергетики, Роман Зінченко, який представляє всім вам відомий інкубатор. Ми будемо сьогодні говорити, ще раз повторюся, з погляду з розвитку альтернативної енергетики, загальних світових трендів і європейських трендів. Про це говоритиме Райнер. А ми з Романом більше зосередимося на саме проєктах просвітницьких, які допоможуть, на наш погляд, розвивати ринок альтернативної енергетики. Це вже так трошки наперед забігаю, відкриваю всі карти.
Thank you for inviting me and thank you for giving me the chance to share some insights with you on the development and the perspectives of renewable energy in Europe and beyond. And let me say, at least in a certain sense, Ukraine is part of Europe, and maybe Ukraine can tap the benefits of renewables with good policy decisions to be taken. What will I talk about today? I will give you a short overview, very comprehensive as it has to be in the few minutes I have here, why renewables should be used, why renewables are used, which are the benefits of renewables. Then I talk about where the European Union is when it comes to development of renewables, what has been achieved and what can be achieved in the near future. Then we talk about the perspectives towards 2050, because it's certainly a good idea to know where you want to be, let me say, in the near future. 2050 is far away enough to dream and to wish, but it's still concrete enough to imagine targets, to imagine things which can be done and which you really can strive to reach. Finally, I will give you some recommendations on how to move forward to achieve a high share of renewables, to transform energy system towards renewables. And maybe if we still have time, I will give you a little example on how challenges for the energy transition can come up and how these challenges can be solved. I'm talking about the question of what is happening when the wind is not blowing? What is happening when the sun is not shining? I already give you the answer now, then we still have electricity, and we will have electricity, but maybe I can give you some insight how this works. Now, renewable energies, why? First of all, let me say, and this is particularly important, we do not speak about renewable energies because we are only in love with the environment. We do not speak about renewable energies, and we apply renewable energies because we are somehow masochist. The reason why we apply renewable energies is that already today, in some parts of the world, they significantly contribute to security of supply. Just to remind you that in a country like Sweden, far up in the north, already today nearly 50% of the energy is coming from renewables. There are countries in South America which have even higher shares of renewables, including large hydro in that case. But renewables is there, and in countries which are not so big, which do not have so much biomass and hydro, like Germany, like Denmark, like Spain, like what we say, well, even theoretically, even like France and Britain, but that's different because they are not so fast in renewables. So all these countries have potentials. Nearly all the countries, and by the way, I'm convinced, Ukraine including, have vast potentials of wind power. The wind is blowing in many places in these countries, and that can be tapped by wind turbines. The solar energy is available in most countries in Europe and beyond, and it can even be used in countries which are not in the sunny belt of the earth. Be aware, Germany, which definitely is not a particularly sunny country, has the highest share of photovoltaic of all countries in the world. This is due to a good support mechanism, but this is also showing that solar energy can be used and should be used everywhere. So, I just forgot to show you the text on the slide. The reason why I was telling you this is that we definitely see that a mix of renewables, various renewables are always available, and the technologies for that, they are not science fiction. They are proven, they are there. Using wind turbines to generate electricity, this is 50 years old technology. Using solar energy for heating is hundreds of years old. Using solar energy for electricity is relatively new, but this is why we have such strong cost decreases, cutting the costs by half in only 5 years, so that now in several countries in Europe, solar energy is cheaper than what the consumer pays to the utility for the electricity which he buys. So proven technology, not to forget hydropower. Hydropower has been used for centuries for various things. Even biomass. Biomass use is an old technology. Now there is a caveat. There is some unsustainable use of biomass. You should not just go into the wood, cut down the wood and burn it, but there are sustainable ways of doing it. There are pellet ovens which you can use, and of course there is a way to burn biomass in a sustainable way in power plants. You can use it for biofuels if you replace it quickly enough. So the mix is there, and this is proven technology. Second one, renewables are not only good for the environment, they are good for the economy. In Europe, in the 27 member states of the European Union, end of 2010, this is where the figures are from, we had more than 550,000 jobs in renewables. And I think if you add the indirect jobs, which are related with some operation and maintenance, etc., it would even be more. We had an annual turnover in that year, and it's about to increase afterwards, of more than 50 billion euros just from renewables. Renewables do not cost too much. Renewables save costs. Renewables save costs by reducing the dependency from energy imports. I think Ukraine, like many of the former Eastern Bloc countries, you have a friendly neighbor who likes to sell gas, at sometimes friendly, sometimes not so friendly prices. And I think one thing, of course, is to try and negotiate good. Another way may be to have a war, which I would firmly suggest not to do. But the third way is just to have your own energy, to use your domestic energy. And wind is, this is Ukrainian wind, you don't have to buy that. Sun, this is Ukrainian sun, you don't have to buy it. Same with biomass. So it really saves energy imports, and these are 2-digit billion euros which can be saved with that. In addition, renewables also mitigate price risks. People are always talking of renewables being too expensive. People are not so often talking, but they should, about oil, for instance, being very expensive. I remember only a few years ago, back in 2004, we had a conference in Bonn, in Germany, a big renewable energy conference. At that time, all people in the world who wanted to support renewables were very, very happy because the oil price per barrel had just reached $40. $40 per barrel. At that time, we thought it was incredibly high. It is incredibly good for renewables. I'm not sure whether you know where the oil price is now. The oil price is somewhere around 100, sometimes higher. We had already an oil price of $140. So this really is a reason why it is good to know for renewables it is clear. Some of them still are a little bit more expensive, but they are becoming cheaper. For conventional fuels, you can be sure, I don't know how fast, but they will never be cheap again, and some of them will be considerably more expensive, just like oil, and not to speak about other technologies. Then, of course, to complete the list of benefits, well, very briefly completing the list of benefits, renewables so far are basically the only source of energy which really mitigates climate change, which is present, which is available, which can be used today. In difference to other technologies, which some people call clean energy, some of them have high risks of accident, some of them emit a lot of carbon, but people hope to be able to capture it sooner or later, but nobody knows when that works. Well, technically it might work, but at which cost it works. For renewables, it's clear they are there, and the costs are decreasing. And again, I think it's necessary to talk a little bit about the question of whether or not renewables are expensive. Yes, indeed, if you look at the levelized costs, solar still is around 15 or something euro cents. Wind, by the way, is around 8 euro cents. This is very close to what a new gas turbine, a new gas power plant costs. So wind, even today, is already cost competitive. And this is true, although still the old technologies are heavily subsidized. Globally, fossil and nuclear fuels still today receive 6 times more subsidies than renewables do. And these are not figures from the renewables community, which we invent to make you believe renewables are cheap. These are figures from the International Energy Agency, which was founded to save the oil reserves of the world back in the oil crisis. So these are really figures which rather underestimate the costs of fossil than overestimate. Still, they say renewables are by far not as much subsidized as conventional energies. Renewables are clean. A wind turbine does not cause any environmental impact, nor does a solar power plant, nor does a hydropower plant if you build it in the proper place. Certainly, there are some impacts, there can be some problems, but this is nothing compared to carbon emissions, which cause climate change, which cause storms, which cause dangerous weathers, and of course carbon emissions, which also have another impact on the health. Dust emissions are bad, and dust emissions are causing problems. And not to talk about the risks of nuclear. Everybody thinks he's smarter than the one who had the accident, but you can never be sure that there is no accident, and if there is an accident, nobody can really say how much it costs. So if these costs were included in the cost of nuclear, nobody would even think of doing it, at least not for financial reasons. So internalizing the costs, and of course, despite various competitive advantages, disadvantages for renewables, they are growing. And by competitive disadvantages, what do I mean? I mean that there is 1 or 2 big companies dominating the energy market. I hesitate to say market, because energy markets tend to be rather monopolies or dominated structures where a few big companies have to say what energy mix they want. This is why renewables have been growing the fastest in those countries where enabling legislation was in place, which made it possible for new market entrants, small and medium companies, to come to the market and install renewable energy. So I skip this because it's too long, showing that the merit order reduces prices. Where are we in the European Union in 2020? Already today. What you see here is a figure, maybe some of you have seen it already. In 2011, starting from 1995, in 2011, more than 71% of all new power capacity in Europe, all the new power capacity installed in that 1 year, was renewable energy. In 2010, it was already 53%, and in 2009, it was 63%. So for the last, well, before that, it was 56. So the last few years, every year, more capacity from renewables was installed than from any other technology. On the fossil side, there is a relevant amount of natural gas power plants. They were also installed, and by the way, they are flexible enough to work together with variable renewables. What you see here, this is wind, blue is wind, a constant level of new installations of wind over the last decade. In the last few years, solar power increased dramatically. And then again, as I said, on the conventional side, gas does play a role, but all the rest is not relevant. To put it even stronger, last year, nearly 50% of global new power capacity was photovoltaic, solar electricity, followed equally by wind and natural gas. So this is not a baby energy, this is not an energy in an infant stadium, this is mature energy. And not only the Europeans are crazy, globally, last year, 2011, 50% of new power capacity was from renewables based on an investment of around 257 billion US dollars. So I think it's clear from these figures for the electricity sector that renewables definitely are mature technologies. I could give you similar examples, not quite as impressive, from other sectors, heating and cooling particularly, and maybe even some good examples from the transport sector, but definitely in the electricity sector, this is where we are most advanced. Now, why is that so? In the European Union, since it began discussing energy policies, there has been kind of legislation, planning, target setting for many years. I won't quote all these things, but to mention a few figures. Already back in 1993, 10 years from now, there were community programs supporting research and development and providing finance for renewables in the European Union. Then in 1999, there was a 4-year campaign for takeoff with a target to install 1 million PV systems, 10,000 megawatts of wind and 10,000 megawatts of biomass electricity. The campaign ended in 2003, having reached the targets. So all this was achieved. Then in 2001, a directive was made providing targets for renewable electricity, in that case from 14% in 2000 to 21% in 2010. This target was reached, not dramatically reached, but it was reached, particularly because some member states were very successful. Then there is a directive on biofuels, and since 2009, we have the European Renewable Energies Directive, which really is a milestone for renewables development. The basic points of it is, and I think this is well known beyond the European Union, there is a target of 20% renewable energy in the overall energy consumption of Europe for 2020. This overall target for the European Union is underpinned by national targets, by binding national targets. Each of the 27 member states of the European Union is legally obliged to reach a certain share of renewables in 2020, depending on the potential, on the economic potential. So to give you the range, the small island Malta has to reach 10% in 2020. The country Sweden, which already today has around 42% of renewable energy, mainly from biomass, they have to reach 50% in 2020. So various, more or less ambitious targets, national support mechanisms in cooperation with others are extremely important, but it very much looks like the European Union will reach the 2020 target. This picture just shows you how differentiated the targets are. from Malta to Sweden. In between there you find the UK, who has a 15% target but nearly achieved nothing. Basically, 21 out of 27 member states are on track end of 2010 or even above their track. Only 6 member states seem to be lagging behind, so that I'm quite optimistic that in 2020 the European Union will certainly have reached the 20%, probably even more than 20%. And 20% in the overall energy mix may more or less be distributed as 34-35% in electricity, 21-22% in heating and cooling, and 10% in biofuels and road transport. And this would lead to minus 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, and it would trigger annual investment between 60 and 70 billion euros. So again, a strong impact on economy. Quickly run you 38 years from now, is it? Yeah, 38 years from now to the future, 2050. The European Commission calculated a few scenarios which all have one thing in common. They should prove to be able to reach the decarbonization targets of the European Union. There is an understanding in the EU that by 2050, all the industrialized countries must have reduced their greenhouse gas emissions by 80 to 95% compared to 1990 levels in order to more or less mitigate climate change. And so the Commission calculated 2 business as usual scenarios and 4 decarbonization scenarios. The key message of all these decarbonization scenarios is that in 2050, if the European Union is to reach the decarbonization targets, there will be very high shares of renewables in the European energy mix, between 53 and 95%. And as I said, this is the overall energy mix. The picture is even more impressive if you look at the electricity sector. Then the figures range between 59 and 83%, and always wind being the strongest, and then followed by solar. In some of the scenarios, they have some nuclear in, but I think this will just vanish through history. Again, I mentioned this as an example. Here you see it in practice. All the decarbonization scenarios reduce import dependency from around 50 to 60% now to around 30 to 40% in 2050. And the most reduction for import dependency is the high renewable scenario with only 35% and import dependency. So, how much will that cost? It will need a lot of investment. The figures which we, and in this case it's the renewable energy industry, calculated, this could be a total investment of up to 3 trillion euros, 3,000 billion euros in 2050. Big figure, but of course that will bring return in forms of taxes, in forms of jobs, etc. And so we are with the jobs. This will avoid at least 1 trillion euros, 1,000 billion euros of costs which otherwise would have to be paid for fossil fuels, fossil fuel imports, or production of fossil fuels. And it will produce around 6 million jobs in Europe in 2050, with 90% greenhouse gas reduction. But all this is possible, all this is useful, all this is necessary, but it will only be possible if we manage to maintain a stable and reliable investment framework policy where investors can rely that they get a reasonable, not exaggerated, but a reasonable return on their investment, and that their investment will not break down in a few years. So with this, Europe can really fully tap the potential of renewables. The combination of a long-term vision, very high shares in 2050, or we would say even 100% in 2050, combined with a midterm target, 20% for 2020, we suggest 45% in 2030, and so on. This may be the way to go. Now, some recommendations. Definitely, it's important not only to maintain and further develop, further refine the existing framework, but it's also important to look beyond 2020 and for the European Union, and I would say also for other countries, to develop a stable framework for the time beyond 2020, so that investors know the growth of renewables should continue, the growth of renewables will continue by decision of population, of politicians, of governments, of parliaments. Of course, this will imply some infrastructure development, this is necessary, but as I said, we need to develop the targets for 2030. And for member states, when I just put Ukraine as an example here, because, and of course because we are in Ukraine, I think the precondition to have all that, the precondition to really be able, as a government, as a parliament, as a public sector, to strive for very, very high shares of renewables, you need the support of the public. If the people in the country do not know that renewables are beneficial, if they doubt, if they think they spoil our prices, if they think they spoil the environment, this is certainly not a good idea. This is why it's important to inform about the benefits, part of which I was trying to do today, but a lot of more work will have to be done for that. It is necessary, if you do not already have that, to have mid-term targets. Mid-term targets, I said the European Union has the 2020 target, now we are discussing about the 2030 target, and these targets have to be ambitious, meaning that must be more than just business as usual. Setting a target in a way that you see what will happen anyway certainly is not ambitious, but they must be realistic. I think, although I would like to dream of it, it would not make sense to say Ukraine has to reach 100% renewables in 2020. I think this certainly would not be realistic. But maybe it's realistic. I really don't know the potentials in this country exactly. But to set an ambitious target of, let me say, 25, 30% for 2020, 2030, this may make sense. Just calculating which are the potentials, how can they be tapped, how can the system be done, and then set up the target and set up a legal framework, set up a policy framework, set up a stable financing framework. Then, of course, support schemes have to be developed or modified if they are already in place. I think some basic elements is what I wrote there on the slides. It does definitely not make sense to have a technology neutral support. It does not make sense to give the same amount of money to a wind turbine than to a solar panel, because solar electricity at present still is more expensive. It does not make sense to give the same amount of money to a wind turbine in a very, very windy coastal site than to a wind turbine which is rather in the inland, in the mainland. And certainly it does not make sense to give the same amount of money to a small biogas installation than to a huge geothermal installation. So differentiation is important. A certain period for which the payment for the investor is guaranteed. I put here 10, 15 or 20 years. 15 or 20 years is the rule, is what is happening in most of the European countries. Certainly makes a lot of sense. Renewable energy producers must have the security that they can sell their electricity. So not only build the power plant, but they must have the security that they are connected to the grid and that their electricity is sold. And of course, this is something which should never be forgot. It's all about cost regression, bringing the costs down. The reason for support is not to make a few people rich. The reason for support is to introduce renewables into the market so that they can grow, and by growth they will bring down the costs. And of course, I think this has to be said again and again until it is realized, we need a level playing field. As long as the market is not a market, as long as new market entrants do not have the slightest chance to come in, it's problematic. As long as costs are not really telling the truth, it's problematic to make the business case for renewables. But I think support mechanisms like we have in most countries of Europe, and at least what I learned about the system which you have in the Ukraine, seems to be working in this direction. So it may make sense. Eventually, and I think I have to be a little bit faster than others, system transformation. I will just run through the basic principles of the German feed-in law, because this is in reality, what I said has to be the basis for a good support scheme. So just see, and I click through it, I just come to the next slide. The challenge will be, the challenge, again, taking an example from Germany, we calculated maybe in 2020 we have 47% of our energy supply from renewables. This would be a huge challenge for the grid system, because it would mean that we no longer have only a little bit of wind like we had in 2007. Little bit of wind, little bit of sun, and the rest was conventional. Coal, gas, nuclear. So this is no problem for any grid system. But if you scale that up to 47%, then it looks like this. Well, it looks a little bit different, yeah, but the basic is okay. Then you see you have very, very high shares of wind. You have very high shares and high peaks of solar. And of course you have sometimes storage or energy imports. What is important, you see, this is the daily load. This is lunchtime, evening, lunchtime, evening, lunchtime, evening. So you see, you have demand peaks. The most of the energy is needed at lunchtime and in the evenings, and relatively little energy is needed at night. And what you also see is that these solar peaks, they nicely coincide with the demand peaks. At lunchtime, solar energy is the strongest. You also see you have times with nearly no wind, and you have times with a lot of wind. And if you look here, wind and solar alone can cover the full demand in that moment. So this poses challenges to the electricity system, which can be overcome. And I mentioned just a few measures. One of them, of course, is an intelligent grid, meaning the grid operator must be able, by grid steering software, by the availability of the power plants, to quickly decide how to balance the variations of the energy system. This can be done by using storage, energy which was stored before. This can be done by shifting demand to the next 2 or 3 hours. And of course, it can be done, and it has to be done for the next foreseeable future, by flexible power plants which are able to be ramped up and ramped down quite quickly. This can be done this can be pumped storage, this can be biogas combustion, but from the conventional side, certainly natural gas is flexible enough and can do that. So I think this challenge to really design and modify the energy system in a way that it is flexible enough to deal with this is the basic secret how to reach high shares of energy. And just to turn this thought around, if we insist on having, let me say, high shares of coal, high shares of nuclear, then there will not be any room in the grid for wind and solar. And then either wind is too expensive or coal has to be curtailed. This is why we firmly suggest, if the decision is taken to go to a clean and sustainable energy system, then try to replace every old power plant which has to be replaced, which normally is an unflexible coal or maybe nuclear power plant. Replace it by a flexible one. Whenever you can, replace it by a renewable one. But also think of some balancing power like you have in biogas, like you have in natural gas, like you have in pumped storage. So I think this idea, replacing an unflexible, so to say, stupid power plant by a smart new one, will be the good idea. And this then will be the main reason for system transformation. And I think with this, I thank you for listening.